It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Sloane Vance laughed as she poured the vintage Bordeaux over Elena Vance's white silk blouse in front of the entire gala committee. The dark, expensive liquid bloomed across the fabric like a spreading bruise, soaking through to the skin. The room, a gilded private dining suite at the Grand Regency, fell into a suffocating silence. Sloane didn't look away. She held the crystal decanter with a manicured hand, her knuckles slightly yellowed against the glass. "Oh, Elena," she cooed, her voice dripping with a performative sympathy that didn't reach her eyes. "I am so sorry. I thought that was the waste bin. You were standing so still, I simply lost track of you." Tiffany St. Clair giggled from the corner, her smartphone already raised to capture the humiliation. The subtle click of the digital shutter was the only other sound in the room. Beside her, Miriam Vance adjusted her fraying Chanel jacket, the gold buttons tarnished at the edges, and sighed with practiced disappointment. "Honestly, Elena, you should have moved," Miriam said, her voice cold. "You've always had a habit of being in the way. Now look at you. You're a mess, and we have the Julian Vane Foundation arriving in 20 minutes. You can't possibly sit at the head table looking like a drowned rat." Elena didn't flinch. She felt the cold, sticky weight of the wine clinging to her chest, the scent of fermented grapes and oak filling her nostrils. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply looked down at the ruin of her blouse. It was a bespoke piece, hand-stitched from heavy mulberry silk with no visible branding, the epitome of the silent luxury she lived by. Sloane wouldn't recognize the quality if it hit her. The younger woman was too busy flaunting a rented Hermes belt and a coat that had seen better decades. "It's just a shirt, Sloane," Elena said, her voice remarkably steady. She reached for a linen napkin and calmly dabbed at a drop of wine that had splashed onto her cheek. "But the vintage was a 1945 Rothschild. It seems a shame to waste something so rare on a temper tantrum." Sloane's face flushed a deep, ugly red. She stepped closer, the sharp scent of her cloying, over-applied perfume, Joy by Jean Padu, clashing violently with the aroma of the wine. "A temper tantrum? I'm trying to save this committee from the embarrassment of your presence. You're a charity case, Elena. A ghost. You live in that dusty apartment, wearing clothes that don't even have a label, while I carry the Vance name forward. You're lucky we even let you through the door." Elena met her sister's gaze. Sloane's eyes were wide, frantic with a need for dominance that felt increasingly fragile. Sloane was an influencer whose engagement was cratering, a woman who had built a life on the identity she had stolen from Elena years ago. She lived in a leased Mercedes and a house with a mounting mortgage, while Elena moved through the world like a shadow, unseen but all-powerful. "The name is only as heavy as the person carrying it," Elena replied softly. "Enough," Miriam snapped, waving a hand dismissively. "Elena, go to the ladies' room and see if you can make yourself presentable. If not, leave through the service entrance. We cannot have the donors seeing you like this." Elena stood, the wet silk heavy against her skin. She felt the eyes of the committee members on her, some sympathetic, most merely curious, watching the downfall of the lesser Vance sister. She turned and walked toward the door, the sound of Sloane's sharp, triumphant laughter following her like a physical blow. Once inside the marble-tiled sanctuary of the restroom, Elena didn't break down. She stood before the mirror, looking at the crimson stain. She reached into her small, unbranded leather clutch and pulled out her phone. It buzzed instantly with a notification. A message from Marcus Thorne. "The final shares of the Regency Holding Group have been transferred. The acquisition of the Grand Regency Hotel is complete. You are now the sole owner of the building, Elena. Do you want me to initiate the Project Amnesia protocols?" Elena stared at the screen. Outside the door, she could hear the muffled sounds of Sloane bragging to Tiffany about how she had put the help in her place. She could hear her mother's voice, sharp and commanding, directing the staff to prepare for Julian Vane's arrival. They had no idea. They thought they were the masters of this world because they wore the right labels and shouted the loudest. She typed a single hand-steady response. "Not yet, Marcus. Let them have their dinner. I want them to feel completely secure before the floor drops out." She tucked the phone away. She caught her reflection in the glass, the sleeping lion they all chose to ignore. She didn't need a label to know her worth. She owned the very air they were breathing in this room. Elena reached for the gold-plated faucet, the water running hot and clear. She began to scrub at the stain, her movements methodical and patient. She could wait. She had waited 5 years to take back what Sloane had stolen. Another hour of humiliation was a small price to pay for the look that would be on Sloane's face when the eviction notices were served. As she stepped back out into the hallway, she saw Julian Vane entering the foyer, flanked by his security detail. He was the man whose validation Sloane desperately craved, the billionaire who could make or break a socialite's career with a single nod. Sloane was already rushing toward him, her fraying Chanel sleeves fluttering as she reached out to grab his arm, her face twisted into a mask of fake, glittering joy. Elena watched from the shadows of the corridor. She saw Julian's eyes scan the room, looking past the noise, looking for the one person who actually mattered. When his gaze briefly met hers, Elena gave a microscopic nod. The countdown had begun. 2 weeks until the Vance anniversary gala. 2 weeks until the identity Sloane had built on a foundation of lies was stripped away in front of the only world she cared about. Elena turned toward the service entrance, just as her mother had ordered. She didn't mind. The view from the top was always better when those below didn't see you coming. The next morning, the breakfast room was a stage set for a play that Sloane Vance was failing to rehearse properly. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, catching the dust motes dancing above a spread of organic fruits and artisanal pastries that neither Sloane nor her mother had paid for. The air smelled of expensive Arabica beans and Sloane's cloying tuberose perfume, a scent so aggressive it felt like a physical intrusion. Elena Vance stood by the sideboard, her movements fluid and silent. She wore a simple charcoal turtleneck, cashmere, though Sloane would never recognize the quality without a logo, and a pair of tailored trousers. She was pouring coffee when the sharp, metallic clink of a silver spoon against fine bone china cut through the silence. "You're late with the cream, Elena," Miriam Vance said, not looking up from her tablet. Her mother's voice was as cold as the marble countertops. "And honestly, that outfit. You look like a funeral director. If you're going to be seen in the main house while Julian is visiting, at least try to look like you belong in this family." Sloane let out a sharp, jagged laugh. She was draped in a fraying Chanel cardigan, her fingers scrolling frantically through her phone. "Don't bother, Mom. Some people are just born to be background noise. Speaking of which, hand me that watch you're wearing." Elena paused, her hand hovering over the silver creamer. She glanced down at her wrist. The watch was a masterpiece of horology, a bespoke, unbranded piece with a tourbillon movement that cost more than the least Merced Sloane paraded on her social media. To the untrained eye, it was just a plain steel band. "No," Elena said, her voice calm and level. Sloane's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. The entitlement in her expression was visceral. "Excuse me. I have a brunch with Tiffany sent, Claire and the girls today. I need a minimalist look to pivot my brand before the gala. That watch is the only thing you own that isn't completely tragic. Give it here." "It isn't for sale, and it isn't a loaner," Elena replied, stepping toward the table to set the cream down. Sloane lunged across the table, her hand clamping around Elena's wrist. Her grip was tight, her manicured nails digging into Elena's skin. The smell of the tuberose perfume became suffocating. "Is this how we're playing it now? After everything this family has done for you? You're a guest here, Elena. A charity case. If I want that watch, I take it." Elena didn't flinch. She met her sister's gaze with a look of such profound, icy detachment that Sloane actually faltered for a second. In that moment, the power dynamic in the room shifted, a silent tectonic plate sliding into place. Elena felt the vibration of her phone in her pocket, a secret pulse of reality. "You should be careful with things you don't understand, Sloane," Elena said quietly. "You might find the cost is higher than you can afford." Miriam sighed, finally looking up. "Sloane, leave the girl alone. If she wants to be stubborn about a piece of junk, let her. We have more important things to discuss. Julian Vane called this morning. He's coming by this afternoon to discuss the gala's keynote. Sloane released Elena's wrist with a disgusted flick, as if she'd been touching something soiled. He's coming here. Today? She immediately began touching her hair, her eyes glazing over with the frantic greed of a social climber seeing the summit. I need to change. I need the vintage Dior. Elena, go to the laundry and make sure it's steamed. Now. Elena turned away, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. She walked toward the service corridor, pulling her phone from her pocket once she was out of sight. A message from Marcus Thorne sat on the encrypted display. The audit of the Vance holdings is complete, the text read. The Project Amnesia protocols are live. You now hold 51% of the parent company's voting shares. The house, the accounts, and the name they're using. It's all legally yours. Just say the word. Elena looked out the small window of the corridor toward the sprawling estate. She could see the gardeners manicuring the hedges, working on property that her sister and mother thought was their birthright. They had no idea that the ground they walked on had already turned to glass. 13 days until the anniversary gala. She typed a short reply to her attorney. Not yet, Marcus. I want them to feel the height of the mountain before I show them the cliff. She tucked the phone away and headed toward the laundry. She didn't mind steaming the dress. It was easier to watch someone's world burn when you were the one who had carefully laid the kindling. The countdown had moved from weeks to days, and for the first time in 5 years, Elena felt the warm, steady hum of justice beginning to wake up. 2 days had passed since Elena Vance had stood in the quiet, humid laundry room of the estate, and the weight of the secret she carried had only grown more solid. The city air was crisp, smelling of impending rain and expensive exhaust, as she stepped into the glass and steel monolith that housed the offices of Thorne and Associates. The transition from the drafty, silent corners of the Vance mansion to this temple of modern power was jarring. Here, the air was filtered and chilled to a precise 68 degrees, carrying the faint, sterile scent of high-end toner and lemon-polished mahogany. Marcus Thorne was waiting for her in his corner office. He didn't rise from behind his desk immediately. He was finishing a signature on a document that likely cost more than the average person's yearly salary. When he finally looked up, his eyes were sharp, devoid of the pity most people offered Elena these days. It's finalized, Marcus said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that commanded the room. He slid a heavy, cream-colored envelope across the polished surface. The original deed to the Vance estate, along with the restructured corporate charter. Everything is in your name, Elena. The house, the grounds, even the air they're breathing in that dining room. Elena reached out, her fingers brushing the thick vellum. The texture was slightly pebbled, a tactile reminder of the reality she had reclaimed. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. She could feel the power radiating from the ink. And the anniversary gala, she asked. The invitations have been sent. The board members, the investors, and Julian Vane are all confirmed, Marcus replied, leaning back. Sloane thinks she's hosting a coronation. She has no idea she's actually organized her own eviction. Elena's phone buzzed in her pocket, a sharp, intrusive vibration. She pulled it out to see a string of frantic texts from Sloane Vance. Where are you? I'm at Vienne's and the card is being declined. Get down here and fix this now. I have a fitting in 10 minutes and I won't be embarrassed by your incompetence. A small, cold smile touched Elena's lips. It seems the first cracks are appearing in her foundation. Don't let her see the blueprint yet, Marcus warned. Keep the lion asleep for 11 more days. I intend to, Elena said, tucking the envelope into her discreet, unbranded leather tote. I want her to feel entirely safe until the moment the floor disappears. She left the office and took a car to the high-end shopping district. The rain had started, a light, misty drizzle that turned the pavement into a dark mirror. Outside Vienne's, a boutique so exclusive it didn't even have a sign on the door, Sloane's silver Mercedes was idling at the curb, blocking a fire hydrant with characteristic entitlement. Elena stepped inside. The boutique smelled of white lilies and cloying, expensive perfume. Sloane was standing in the center of the showroom, her face flushed a blotchy red that her heavy foundation couldn't quite hide. She was clutching a sheer, beaded gown that looked like it was made of spun moonlight, a dress that cost $40,000 and was intended for the gala. Tiffany sent, Claire stood nearby, pretending to check her nails but clearly savoring the drama. Two sales associates stood with their hands clasped in front of them, their expressions masks of professional neutrality that hid deep disdain. "Finally!" Sloane snapped as soon as she saw Elena. She shoved the dress toward a startled assistant. "This idiot says the Vance corporate account is under review. Call the bank. Tell them who I am. I'm not leaving without this dress." "The account isn't under review, Sloane," Elena said, her voice calm and level, a sharp contrast to her sister's screeching. "I placed a temporary hold on non-essential spending for the gala preparations. We have to be mindful of the quarterly audit." Sloane's eyes narrowed, her chest heaving. "Mindful? I'm the face of this company. This dress is essential. You're just a glorified secretary, Elena. Don't you ever forget that your only job is to make my life easier." Sloane stepped closer, the scent of her lilies becoming suffocating. She reached out and flicked the lapel of Elena's simple, charcoal wool coat. "Look at you. You look like you're heading to a funeral in that drab rag. Maybe that's why you're so bitter. You'll never know what it feels like to wear something this beautiful." "You're right," Elena replied, her gaze never wavering. "I have a very different perspective on what is beautiful." "Just fix the card," Sloane hissed, leaning in so only Elena could hear. "Or I'll have Miriam remind you exactly how replaceable you are. One word from me and you're back on the street with nothing but that pathetic suitcase you arrived with." Elena felt the heavy weight of the envelope in her bag. It pressed against her hip, a silent, lethal weapon. She could end this now. She could pull out the deed and watch Sloane's world shatter in the middle of this boutique. She could watch Tiffany's fake smile turn to ash. But the gala was 11 days away. The mountain was still tall, and Sloane hadn't reached the peak yet. "I'll authorize a one-time override for the dress," Elena said. Sloane smirked, her triumph immediate and ugly. She turned back to the sales associates. "See, I told you she'd fix it. She knows her place." Sloane didn't thank her. She didn't even look at her again as she went back to admiring herself in the three-way mirror. Elena walked to the counter, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. She authorized the payment, watching the numbers flash on the screen. $40,000 of her own money, spent to buy her sister a costume for her own downfall. As she walked out into the rain, Elena pulled her coat tighter. She looked at the countdown on her phone. 11 days. The kindling was dry, the matches were ready, and Sloane Vance was currently dancing in the center of the pyre, completely unaware that the music was about to stop. 3 days remained until the Julian Vane Foundation Gala. The air in the sun-drenched conservatory of the Vance estate smelled of expensive lilies and Sloane's cloying, oversweet perfume. It was a suffocating combination, much like the conversation currently happening over the marble-topped patio table. Sloane Vance lounged in a wicker chair, her legs crossed to show off her least designer heels. She was busy scrolling through her phone, barking orders at a harried-looking assistant while her mother, Miriam Vance, adjusted a centerpiece that didn't need moving. Elena sat across from them, her posture perfect, her unbranded silk blouse a sharp contrast to the loud, logo-heavy tracksuit her sister wore. "I've decided Elena shouldn't sit at the head table," Sloane said, not even looking up from her screen. "It'll look cluttered. Besides, the photographers are looking for the face of Vance. Having a plain architect in the background ruins the aesthetic." Miriam nodded absently, her eyes fixed on Sloane with a terrifying sort of pride. "She's right, Elena. You've always been more of a behind-the-scenes girl. It's better if you stay near the catering entrance. You can keep an eye on the logistics. Someone has to make sure the champagne stays cold." The silver spoon in Elena's hand clicked softly against the rim of her bone china cup. The sound was sharp, a tiny herald of the storm to come. "The catering entrance?" she asked, her voice as smooth as glass. "You want me to stand with the staff at my own family's legacy event." "Legacy," Sloane snorted, finally looking up. Her eyes were bright with a cruel, entitled heat. "You're the one who walked away to play with blueprints, remember? I'm the one who kept the brand alive on socials. I'm the one Julian Vane actually wants to see. You're just the bank account, Elena. And honestly, you should be grateful I'm even letting you attend." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a hiss. "In fact, why don't you just hand over your VIP pass now?" "Tiffany sent. Claire needs an extra spot for her film crew. You don't need a pass to stand by the kitchens." The audacity was a physical weight in the room. Elena felt the familiar heat of indignation, but she didn't let it reach her face. Instead, she reached into her leather portfolio and pulled out a sleek, embossed folder. The texture of the heavy cardstock was cool against her fingertips, the physical manifestation of a trap 3 years in the making. "I wouldn't worry about the seating chart just yet, Sloane," Elena said. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her tea. "The Julian Vane Foundation is very particular about who they associate with. They've been doing some deep dive audits on all the gala sponsors this week." Sloane rolled her eyes, waving a manicured hand dismissively. "Audits, please, they love me. I have 3 million followers. Julian himself liked my last post." "He likes a lot of things," Elena replied, her gaze locking onto her sister S. "But he hates a lack of transparency. If I were you, I'd spend less time worrying about where I'm sitting and more time making sure your personal filings match the company's tax records. It would be a shame if your face of Vance persona cracked under a little bit of legal scrutiny." Sloane's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. She glanced at Miriam, who was busy preening. "What is that supposed to mean?" "Are you threatening me? With what, a spreadsheet?" "It's not a threat," Elena said, standing up. She looked down at them both, the sleeping lion finally showing a hint of its claws. "It's a warning. You've spent so long dancing in the center of the pyre that you've forgotten what happens when the music stops. Enjoy the dress, Sloane. Truly. It's the most expensive thing you'll ever own." As Elena walked toward the glass doors, she passed Tiffany St. Clair, who was hovering in the hallway with a camera. Tiffany's usual vapid grin was gone. She was staring at Elena with a look of genuine confusion, her phone forgotten in her hand. She had heard the tone in Elena's voice, the absolute, unshakable confidence of someone who already knew the ending of the story. Once she was safely in the back of her car, Elena's phone buzzed. It was a message from Marcus Thorne. "Project Amnesia is live. The Foundation has received the verified ownership documents. Julian Vane is requesting a private briefing before the toast. The matches are lit, Elena." Elena looked out the window at the receding Vance estate. The countdown was no longer in days. It was in hours. She leaned back against the leather seat, the cold weight of the evidence folder in her lap. "Drive," she told the chauffeur. "We have one more stop before the music stops." The evening arrived with a predatory hum, the kind of electric tension that vibrated through the floorboards of the grand ballroom before the first guest even crossed the threshold. The scent of 1,000 lilies, cloying and heavy, hung in the air like a floral shroud, masking the metallic tang of high-stakes nerves. It was the night of the Vance Foundation Gala, a spectacle of performative charity where the city's elite gathered to admire their own reflections in the polished marble. Sloane Vance stood at the center of the room, a glass of vintage crystal held loosely in her hand. She was draped in a vintage Chanel gown that was arguably a masterpiece, though the delicate lace at the hem was beginning to fray, a subtle, desperate sign of a lifestyle outrunning its bank account. She laughed, a sharp, practiced sound that carried over the string quartet, ensuring everyone within 20 feet knew she was the sun around which this gala orbited. "It's all about legacy," Sloane told a huddle of socialites, her voice dripping with an unearned authority. "My family has always understood that wealth is a responsibility. That's why I've dedicated this year's foundation goals to the Rebirth Initiative. It's about giving people a second chance, if they deserve it, of course." Tiffany St. Clair stood nearby, her phone raised like a weapon as she captured every second for her followers. She nodded eagerly, though her eyes flickered toward the entrance every few seconds. She had seen the look on Elena's face the day before, and the influencer's instinct for a viral collapse was tingling. Miriam Vance moved through the crowd like a shark in silk, her gaze sharp and unforgiving. She adjusted a diamond brooch on her lapel, her posture rigid. To her, this night wasn't just a party, it was a fortification. If they could make it through the toast, the theft of Elena's designs and the Vance name would be cemented in the public record forever. Then, the heavy oak doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open. Elena Vance didn't enter with a flourish. She didn't need one. She moved with the silent, terrifying grace of someone who owned the air she breathed. She wore a bespoke suit of charcoal silk, unbranded and devoid of any visible logos, yet the way the fabric caught the light spoke of a price tag that would make Sloane's leased Mercedes look like a toy. Her hair was pulled back into a sleek, severe knot, revealing the cold, unshakable calm in her eyes. The room didn't go silent yet, but the temperature seemed to drop. Elena felt the weight of the evidence folder in her mind, a mental map of every lie Sloane had ever told. She caught the scent of the lilies again. They smelled like a funeral. "You're late," a voice whispered beside her. Marcus Thorne stepped out from the shadows of a Corinthian pillar. He looked every bit the high-priced executioner in his tuxedo, his expression unreadable. He adjusted his cufflinks, the silver glinting under the chandeliers. "I'm exactly where I need to be, Marcus," Elena replied, her voice a low, steady anchor in the sea of chatter. "Is Julian here?" "He's in the VIP lounge with the board directors," Marcus said, leaning in closer. "They've seen the preliminary audit. The mood in there is volatile. Sloane has no idea the Foundation's accounts were frozen 10 minutes ago." Elena felt a spark of cold satisfaction. It was a small win, a dopamine hit of justice that sustained her as she began her walk toward the center of the room. She passed a waiter carrying a tray of hors d'oeuvres, the silver tray reflecting her steady gaze. Every step was a countdown. Sloane spotted her across the room. The antagonist's face didn't crumble, not yet. Instead, it hardened into a mask of pure, entitled rage. She handed her glass to a confused guest and marched toward Elena, her heels clicking like a metronome of impending conflict. "What are you doing here?" Sloane hissed, stopping inches from Elena's face. The smell of expensive gin and desperation rolled off her in waves. "I told security you were barred. You don't belong in this room, Elena. You're a ghost." "A nobody. You should be back in that cramped studio, sketching things you'll never afford to wear." Elena didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at her sister, noting the way the Chanel lace was catching on the heel of Sloane's shoe. "I'm here to see the ending, Sloane," she said softly. "You've spent 5 years playing a role. I thought I'd come and watch the curtain fall." Sloane let out a jagged laugh, drawing the attention of the surrounding guests. Tiffany moved closer, the camera lens focused on the two sisters. "You think a few documents and a lawyer can touch me? I am the Vance Foundation. I am the name on the door. You're just the girl who got left behind." Sloane leaned in, her voice a venomous crawl. "Look at them, Elena. They don't even know who you are. To them, you're just a guest who dressed too conservatively for a gala. In 5 minutes, I'm going on that stage, and Julian Vane is going to hand me a check that will make me untouchable. And you'll be escorted out by the same men who let you in." Elena reached out and gently straightened the lapel of Sloane's fraying jacket. The contact made Sloane recoil as if she'd been burned. "You're right about one thing," Elena said, her eyes locking onto Sloane's with a terrifying intensity. "The name on the door matters, which is why it's going to be so interesting when Julian reads the deed." Sloane's brow furrowed, a flicker of genuine confusion finally breaking through her arrogance. "The deed? What are you talking about?" Before she could answer, the chimes for the toast rang out through the ballroom. The sound was clear and final, like a bell tolling for the condemned. Julian Vane appeared at the top of the grand staircase, his presence commanding immediate, absolute silence. He was a man who embodied true authority, his face a weathered map of integrity. He looked down at the crowd, his gaze lingering for a fraction of a second on Elena before settling on the woman standing at the center of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian's voice boomed, amplified by the ballroom's perfect acoustics. If you could all take your seats. We have a very special announcement regarding the future of the Vance estate. Sloane smirked, throwing one last look of triumph at Elena. Watch closely, she whispered. This is the part where you disappear. She turned and began to walk toward the stairs, her head held high, oblivious to the fact that Marcus Thorne was already signaling the security team at the back of the room. Elena stood perfectly still, the cold weight of the lilies no longer stifling, but refreshing. The music stopped. The room held its breath. Julian Vane opened a leather-bound folder, but he didn't look at the speech Sloane's team had written for him. He looked at a single, notarized document that had been delivered to him an hour prior. Before we begin the toast, Julian said, his voice dropping to a tone of clinical precision, there is a matter of legal clarity that must be addressed. Elena watched Sloane's back stiffen. The countdown had reached 0. Julian Vane adjusted the microphone, the sharp screech of feedback cutting through the expectant murmurs of the ballroom. He didn't look at the teleprompter Sloane had prepared. Instead, he laid a single, heavy sheet of vellum over the podium. Sloane Vance stood just a few feet away, her fingers tracing the gold rim of her champagne flute. She didn't notice Elena standing in the shadow of the velvet curtains, as still and lethal as a drawn blade. There has been a significant development regarding the Vance architectural patents, Julian said, his voice dropping into a tone of clinical, terrifying precision. Sloane stepped forward, her silk gown whispering against the marble. Julian, darling, the toast first. The press is waiting for the announcement of my new collection. She threw a sharp, triumphant look toward the shadows where she thought Elena was hiding, her lips curling in a sneer. Some people are quite eager to see the help escorted out so we can begin the real celebration. Elena didn't flinch. She simply caught the eye of Marcus Thorne, who stood near the back of the room with a tablet in hand. With a single, sharp nod from Elena, Marcus tapped the screen. The massive projector behind the podium hummed to life, the scent of ozone and warm electronics drifting through the front row. But it didn't show the sleek, modern renderings of Sloane's supposed new vision. Instead, a series of high-resolution forensic audits and original, hand-drawn blueprints from 10 years ago filled the 30-foot display. The room went deathly silent. The only sound was the rhythmic click of the cooling fans in the projector. Sloane's smile didn't just fade, it disintegrated. The vibrant, artificial glow of her performative joy vanished, replaced by a gray, sickly pallor that seemed to seep from her hairline down to her throat. Her eyes, usually wide with calculated innocence, shrank into terrified pinpricks as she stared at the signature on the screen. Elena's signature, dated 3 years before Sloane had ever set foot in an architecture firm. Her jaw went slack, her lower lip trembling with a rhythmic, uncontrollable twitch that made her look suddenly, pathetically old. The muscles in her neck corded like strained wire, and a fine sheen of cold sweat broke across her forehead, turning her expensive foundation into a muddy mask of impending ruin. She looked like a statue caught in the middle of a slow-motion collapse, the very air in her lungs seemingly turning to lead, as she realized the world was watching her fraud in real time. Tiffany St. Clair didn't move to comfort her. Instead, she raised her iPhone, her face illuminated by the cold blue light of the screen as she began a live stream. "Oh my God," Tiffany whispered into the phone, her thumb tapping the screen to zoom in on the stolen signatures. "Are you guys seeing this? The whole thing is a lie." Miriam Vance let out a sharp, choked gasp, her hand flying to the triple-strand pearls at her throat. She looked from the screen to her daughter, her face a mask of horrified realization. The socialites around her began to shift their chairs, the physical distance between them and the Vance family growing with every passing second. "These documents," Julian continued, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling, "prove that every major design attributed to Sloane Vance over the last 5 years was, in fact, the sole intellectual property of Elena Vance. Furthermore, the estate itself has been held in a blind trust that Sloane has been illegally drawing from." Sloane finally found her voice, though it was thin and ragged. "This is a mistake. Elena is a failure. She's nothing. Julian, tell them." She turned toward the audience, her hands shaking so violently that the champagne in her glass slopped over the side, staining her white silk dress a deep, ugly crimson. Elena stepped out from behind the curtain and into the light of the projector. The blue light of the stolen blueprints washed over her, making her look like a ghost of the truth. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. "You told me I didn't belong in this house, Sloane," Elena said, her voice steady and cold. "You were right. I don't belong in a house built on theft and lies. That's why I've already signed the papers to liquidate the estate and donate the proceeds to the Architectural Preservation Fund." Sloane reached for the podium, her knuckles white. "You can't do that. I'm the face of this family." "You're a footnote," Elena replied, her eyes never leaving her sister's crumbling face. "And as of 5 minutes ago, Marcus has filed the injunction. You have until midnight to pack your things. Security will meet you at the door." Elena turned her back on the chaos, the sound of Tiffany's commentary and Miriam's sobbing fading as she walked toward the grand oak doors. She didn't look back to see the security team moving toward the podium. She simply walked out into the cool night air, the weight of 5 years of silence finally lifting from her shoulders. Behind her, the ballroom erupted into a frenzy of camera flashes and whispered judgments, but Elena was already gone. She had one more call to make, and the countdown to the final reckoning had just hit 0. The silence inside the obsidian black sedan was a physical weight, a stark contrast to the cacophony Elena Vance had left behind. She leaned her head against the cool leather headrest, closing her eyes as the city lights blurred into long, golden streaks against the window. It had been precisely 7 minutes since she'd walked out of the gala, and already, the digital world was beginning to cannibalize what remained of her sister's reputation. Beside her, Marcus Thorne tapped a rhythm on his tablet, the screen glowing with a frantic feed of social media alerts and news tickers. He didn't speak immediately, allowing the hum of the high-performance engine to anchor the moment. The scent of expensive upholstery and the faint, sharp ozone of the car's ionizer filled the cabin. "She's trying to spin it," Marcus said, his voice a low baritone that cut through the stillness. He turned the screen toward her. On the grainy live stream, Sloane Vance stood at the podium, her fraying Chanel jacket hanging off one shoulder as she gestured wildly at the retreating backs of the investors. Her voice was shrill, a desperate pitch that lacked its usual rehearsed honey. The ballroom, once a temple to her vanity, had become a theater of the absurd. "It's a glitch." Sloane screamed into the microphone, the feedback echoing like a dying animal. "Elena is unstable. She's always been jealous of my success. This is a deep fake, a coordinated attack by someone who couldn't hack it in the real world." But the room wasn't listening. The power dynamic had shifted so violently that the air in the ballroom seemed to have thinned. Tiffany sent, Claire, who only an hour ago had been Sloane's shadow, was already positioned in front of a circle of reporters near the champagne fountain. She wasn't defending her friend. She was holding up her phone, her thumb scrolling rapidly through a series of leaked texts that documented Sloane's systematic theft of Elena's designs. The enabler had become the executioner, smelling the social blood in the water and choosing survival over a sinking ship. "I always had my suspicions," Tiffany told a blogger, her voice carrying over the din. "Sloane was always so secretive about her process. Now we know why. It wasn't a process, it was a heist." Julian Vane stepped into the frame on the screen then, his presence alone silencing the frantic murmurs of the crowd. He didn't look at the cameras. He looked directly at Sloane with a pity so profound it was more insulting than rage. He was the authority they all feared, the man whose checkbook dictated the city's social hierarchy. "The audit is complete, Sloane," Julian said, his voice carrying the weight of a final judgment. "The accounts you thought were yours, the ones you used to lease that lifestyle, they never existed. You were spending Elena's shadow equity, thinking it was a gift from your mother. But Miriam never had the money. She only had the lies." The camera zoomed in on Sloane's face as the realization finally took hold. It was a slow-motion collapse of an identity built on sand. Her eyes, usually sharp with practiced condescension, went vacant and glassy, reflecting the harsh LED lights of the ballroom like a deer caught in high beams. The crimson flush of her anger drained away in an instant, leaving her skin a sickly, translucent gray that made her expensive makeup look like a cracked death mask. Her mouth hung open, her lower lip trembling as she tried to form a word, any word, to stop the bleeding, but her throat seemed to have seized. She looked smaller, suddenly, the fraying Chanel and the name-dropping of dead ancestors unable to shield her from the vacuum of her own making. Her shoulders slumped, her posture mimicking a marionette whose strings had been cut mid-performance. Miriam Vance appeared at the edge of the frame, her face a mask of crumbling porcelain. She reached for Sloane's arm, perhaps to comfort her, or perhaps to steady herself as the social floor vanished. Sloane shoved her mother away with a jagged, ugly movement that caused a collective gasp from the witnesses. It was the final betrayal, caught in 4K for the world to see. "Don't touch me," Sloane shrieked, her voice cracking. "This is your fault. You told me she was nothing." Elena watched the screen for a moment longer before reaching out and sliding the power button to black. The reflection of her own face appeared in the dark glass, calm, steady, and entirely unrecognizable to the girl who had been cast out 5 years ago. "The injunction is being enforced," Elena asked, her voice steady. "Security is at the estate now," Marcus confirmed, his fingers flying across the tablet as he coordinated with the ground team. "The locks are being cycled. The leased vehicles are being flagged for repossession. By dawn, Sloane won't even have a key to the front gate. Julian has already moved to strike her name from the foundation board. It's a total blackout, Elena." The car glided to a halt in front of a discreet, high-security glass tower, Elena's true base of operations. She stepped out into the cool night air, the silence of the street, a reward she had earned through years of strategic patience. She had watched them flaunt what they stole, and now she would watch them realize they never truly owned a single second of it. Her phone buzzed in her hand, a restricted number. She knew the digital signature. It was the private line Sloane used when she wanted to demand a favor or issue an ultimatum. Elena answered, but she didn't speak. She waited for the sound of the breathing on the other end, ragged, panicked, and broken. "Elena," Sloane's voice was a ghost of its former self, stripped of its arrogance. "Elena, please, you can't do this. Mom is. She's having a breakdown. We have nowhere to go." Elena looked up at the towering glass of her empire, the cold wind whipping her hair across her face. She felt no surge of joy, only the clean, sharp click of a puzzle finally completed. "I told you at the gala, Sloane," Elena said, her voice like a scalpel. "You're a footnote, and I'm the one who just closed the book." She ended the call before the sobbing could start. As she walked toward the lobby, Marcus caught up to her, his face grim. "There's one more thing," he said, holding out a new notification. "It's not just the money. The district attorney just called. They found the original ledger Miriam tried to burn." Elena paused at the glass doors, her reflection overlapping with the city skyline. The reckoning wasn't over. It was just moving from the ballroom to the courtroom. 6 months later, the dust from the Vance family collapse had finally settled into a fine gray ash. Elena Vance stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her new executive suite, the morning sun glinting off the polished obsidian of her desk. There were no logos here, no flashy displays of branded wealth, just the quiet, rhythmic hum of a multi-billion-dollar architectural firm running with surgical precision. She adjusted the cuff of her bespoke charcoal blazer, feeling the cool weight of the vintage watch her father had hidden away years ago, the only heirloom Miriam hadn't managed to pawn for a designer handbag. The scent of fresh cedar and expensive espresso filled the room, a sharp contrast to the cloying, heavy floral perfumes that used to suffocate her in the old family estate. Elena watched the city move below her, a sea of people unaware that the landscape of their skyline was now being dictated by the woman they had once dismissed as a charity case. Marcus Thorne entered the office without knocking, his footsteps muffled by the thick, hand-woven wool rug. He looked younger than he had during the trial, the stress of the legal trap replaced by the satisfied glow of a man who had successfully dismantled a dynasty. He set a leather-bound folder on the desk, the heavy paper snapping with a sound like a gavel. "It's finished, Elena," he said, his voice low and resonant. "The final asset liquidation was completed at midnight. The Vance name has been legally scrubbed from the foundation. Every cent recovered from Miriam's offshore accounts has been diverted into the scholarship fund for underprivileged architects." Elena didn't turn around immediately. She traced the line of a new skyscraper on the horizon, her skyscraper. "And my sister." "Sloane Vance is currently residing in a 40-unit complex in the industrial district," Marcus replied, a trace of irony coloring his tone. "She's working the returns counter at a mid-tier department store. I'm told she spent yesterday afternoon being publicly berated by a customer over a store credit policy. The customer, as it happens, was Tiffany St. Clair." Elena felt a brief, cold flicker of satisfaction in her chest. Sloane, the woman who had once poured vintage crystal over Elena's head for not belonging at a gala, was now a servant to the very social circles she had tried so desperately to gatekeep. The old money status symbols, the leased Mercedes, the fraying Chanel, the name-dropping of dead ancestors, had been replaced by a polyester uniform and a plastic name tag that didn't even include her surname. Sloane was no longer an influencer. She was a footnote in a cautionary tale about the price of stolen identity. "She tried to call the office again this morning," Marcus added, checking his tablet. "Claimed she was having a mental health crisis and needed a bridge loan. I had security block the number." "Good," Elena said, finally turning to face him. Her expression was a mask of professional calm, though her eyes held the hard-won wisdom of someone who had crawled through glass to reach the top. "She made her choices. She can live with the consequences." Later that afternoon, Julian Vane joined her for a quiet celebration in the firm's private lounge. The room was silent except for the soft clink of ice against crystal. Julian raised his glass, his eyes reflecting the respect of an equal. "To the new era," he said. "The Vance-Vane partnership is the talk of the coast. You've done more than just win, Elena. You've rebuilt a legacy from the ground up." "I didn't rebuild it, Julian," she corrected him softly, her gaze drifting to the empty chair across from her. "I saved it from the people who were burning it down." Despite the victory, a heavy silence settled between them. Elena had the empire. She had the justice she had craved for 5 long, grueling years. But as she looked at the city she now helped rule, she felt the phantom ache of the family she had lost. The house she had grown up in was now a boutique hotel owned by a Japanese conglomerate. Her mother, Miriam, was living in a state-mandated care facility, her mind fractured by the sudden loss of the status that had been her only identity. Elena walked back to her desk and picked up a small, framed photograph she kept in the top drawer. It was her father, standing on a construction site, his hands covered in red clay and a blueprint tucked under his arm. He was smiling. She had won the war, but the battlefield was a graveyard of her own history. She had become the sleeping lion everyone feared, but the price of her roar had been the absolute isolation of the summit. As the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the obsidian desk, Elena Vance sat down in the high-backed leather chair. She picked up a pen, the weight of it familiar and grounding. There were new blueprints to approve, new foundations to lay. The past was a closed book, its pages stained with wine and betrayal. The future, however, was a clean white sheet, waiting for her to draw the first line. She was no longer the girl in the stained dress. She was the architect of her own fate, and for the first time in her life, the silence of the room didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like peace.
I hope you enjoyed this wild story. Don't forget to subscribe for more. See you in the next one.